Next on UOMO Magazine, we will visit with a former UOMO graduate whose name is synonymous with horror, Stephen King.
What elements are involved in making a horror film really successful?
You scared?
Stay with us, if you dare, for the next half hour as UOMO Magazine presents Stephen King, an alumni in profile. One of the best ways for a university to gain recognition of its excellence is by highlighting the achievements of its distinguished alumni. On October 9, 1981, the General Alumni Association at UOMO awarded the Career Award to Author Stephen King, a graduate from the class of 1970. In less than 10 years, Stephen King has written 10 bestsellers, which include Carrie, The Stand, Salem's Lot, Night Shift, The Dead Zone, The Shining, Firestarter, Cujo, Different Seasons, and Dance Macabre. Book sales have already totaled over 30 million copies, and most of the movie rights have already been sold. King has described his success as a result of having a marketable obsession, an obsession with horror. Very simply, Stephen King writes out his nightmares. We visited the King residence in Bangor, Maine, in order to explore the origin of Stephen King's marketable obsession.
Do you ever sleep with the lights on?
I always sleep with the light on. I don't sleep with the light on right in the room, you know, that would be Bush League, because I'm not a kid anymore. You know, I don't have an E.T. nightlight. I don't have Winnie the Pooh. My kids have got those, because they're just kids. And I'm a grown-up, so I leave the bathroom light on and just leave the door open a little bit, and if anybody says, why do you do that, Steve? I say, so I won't, like, trip over something when I'm going, you know, to the bathroom in the night, or if I have to get up and check on one of the kids. But the real reason is because it keeps the monsters away. This is the bottom line. Everybody understands that if there is enough light in the room at night, the monsters cannot get in. So,
has that sort of been the thing that led you to write the kind of material you write?
Yes, in a sort of backwards way, but it works frontwards as well. The more you do it, I think the more sensitized you get to the material. It's not a blunting process. I think a lot of people believe that if you do it enough, you get very blunt. But actually what happens is the more that you do it, it's like sharpening a pencil. I suppose sooner or later the pencil itself just disappears, and that's the end of it. But
so you don't feel that you get jaded by your work? You feel that you get the same reaction, even more so intensified the more you do?
Not jaded. I think it's gotten tougher for me sometimes to find new ways to express the emotions that I've dealt with, I won't say for so long. For instance, I'm just a kid still compared to a guy like Graham Greene, who wrote suspense novels for 50 years, or John Creasy, who wrote mystery novels for 50 years. So I don't feel that I'm in it so long that jaded is a factor, but I've been in it long enough now. I've been writing horror tales, I would say, published and unpublished, since I was about 16. So that you have to find a new way to say his face went white, you know, or he felt afraid. Because also, if you don't continue to seek those things, you're not discovering anything new about your chosen field or what you're writing about.
What are some of the major differences between the way a book is written for the idea of a person consuming a book, reading a book, and an original screenplay, for instance, The Creep Show? How does that compare to the differences between books and films?
Well, I love movies, you know. what you're asking me covers a lot of ground. Movies and books are diametrically opposite in their effect in most ways, because a novel or a story is a uniquely individual thing. You curl up in a corner with a book, and you're by yourself, you're alone. And in a way, that's exactly the situation that a horror writer or a writer of suspense tales likes. You know, you've got you by yourself. You're already well on your way to being afraid when you're by yourself. So that's good. And anybody who's ever been in a movie knows that the reaction when something scary happens is the whole audience will scream, and then everybody will laugh right after that, because that's a kind of group reaction. The laugh is a reaction to the fright that you felt. It's also a way of showing the people all around you, I wasn't really scared, you know, that's just for fun. I just screamed because I had a little bellyache there for a second. It's gone by now. The other thing that happens in a movie is the audience will laugh after the scream, which a director thinks is okay and a scriptwriter thinks is okay. But a lot of times they'll laugh where you didn't want them to laugh. And that's a sign of real ineptitude, because people will do anything to draw off that buildup of tension inside them. And the laugh is one way that we get rid of it, and the scream is the other. When you go to a movie, if you go to one of these sixplexes and you're in the lobby of a theater, one of those hive jobs that has a lot of movie screens, you can hear a sound from one of the screens, and if you don't know what's playing, you don't know if they're watching a comedy or a horror picture. You just know that it's one or the other, because those are the only two kinds of movies where people actually vocalize in the movies, other than the usual nerds that will sit around, you know, and talk through the whole movie like they were in their living room.
There's a real difference between showing gore and then creating a tension, like Alfred Hitchcock. What elements are involved in making a horror film really successful?
If somebody ties a girl down to a table and uses a bucksaw to open her wide up, you know, and guts spew everywhere, you scream because you're revolted, and maybe you go, ugh, like that. Has nothing to do with the quality of the set, you know, or the direction or anything else. Show people guts, they're going to scream. You know, it's one of the great truths of life. Hitchcock's idea in Psycho was if you shove a big enough block of utter horror at the audience, you got him. You don't really have to do anything else after that. The story is that he elected to film Psycho in black and white because he didn't want people to look at all that red blood in the shower stall. He wanted the black blood, you know, removed it, and that's true. What happens with the shower scene is whether or not the knife actually goes into the lady, into Janet Leigh, almost doesn't matter, because we think we see it go into her until we've seen the film 20 or 30 times, and its effect has been vitiated by film series and these film instructors that will run their yarks until you're ready to throw up, you know. After all that, the film doesn't have any impact regardless.
In relinquishing rights to movies, though, do you feel uncomfortable when you release total control, and then there it is, and then they'll do what they want to do with it, what they can do with it, with budgets, and suddenly there are all kinds of constrictions now. How does that feel when you finally see that end result and it's maybe totally different from what you intended it to be?
Does a parent feel uncomfortable when he sends his kid off to college? People say to me, how do you feel about this or that? Don't you think that they ruined, that Stanley Kubrick ruined The Shining or whatever? James Cain did an interview with some guy who was moaning about how Hollywood had ruined Cain's work. Postman Always Rings Twice and Double Indemnity and all that. He says, they ruined your books. And Cain looked around, they were all on a shelf, and he said, no, they didn't, they're all right up there. I don't think a movie can ruin a book, because a book has a longer life. A book is still on the shelf. It goes away from the 7-day, you know, books in the library and all that, finally finds its way into the stacks. But I personally think that there will still be kids who will be stumbling across Salem's Lot in the stacks 100 years from now and taking it home. That is, if there's a human race in 100 years.
Jeffrey Shiro, a former UMO student, produced a student film based on your story, The Boogeyman. I read The Boogeyman, and I saw his film, and I felt it was a very interesting adaptation in the sense where he took a story that took place in one location and made several locations out of it. How did you feel about that adaptation?
I felt fine about it. I think that it has flaws, but I don't think they're worth talking about. Jeff's a young filmmaker. The important thing about it is that it's extremely talented.
Who killed the children?
Boogeyman. Boogeyman killed him. Just came out of the closet and killed him. Now, maybe if you think of a thing long enough and you believe in it, maybe it becomes real.
Well, actually, I first had the idea when I was at the University of Maine in 77 through 79, and I'd read the story from his book Night Shift, and I thought it would make a great film. At that time, I had no idea I would really get the opportunity to do it. With this film, since it is based on a story from a well-known author, Stephen King, I had to go through the process of getting the rights from the story, and that took quite a while to do. A lot of the problems come with the actors often, because it is a student production and it's a showcase film, which means the actors aren't being paid. And sometimes it's hard to gain their respect as a filmmaker since you are a student. But that's probably the hardest part in actuality, is trying to get the good performance.
What's really impressive about it is the way that the guy stayed with it, the way that Jeff stayed with it, because he made it, I think, for about $10,000. And if you're a kid and you're in film school, $10,000, you know, it just doesn't drop out of a bush. So he worked on the film, I think, off and on for about 2 years, and it has a real professional look to it.
Dr. Harper.
It is only a game, Mr. Billings.
Let's talk about Creepshow a little bit. The fact that that was an original screenplay for a film. It was not a book originally. Is that correct? How is that different, writing for a movie so that the end result was intended for a film? Did you feel more control?
I felt liberated. I felt, I felt more control, okay? I was in on the project. In another sense, I felt liberated because when you adapt your novel into a screenplay, and I've done this 3 or 4 times now. I did one for The Shining, I did one for Dead Zone, I did one for Cujo. None of those screenplays are being used, which is a pretty standard, pattern for books versus screenplays, with screenwriters who are doing originals as well as novelists who are turning their books into screenplays, although we labor under a stigma because a lot of Hollywood people don't like novelists. They're afraid that they'll want to see the book as graven in stone. But the whole act of adapting is like sitting on a suitcase that you fill with too many clothes. It's also like being an editor for Reader's Digest condensed books, and I'll never do it again. And I think that instinctively I understood that, and I avoided it with a number of the books that were sold. But with the original, I felt that I could let it come out the way that it wanted to. And even in the case of Creepshow, it's only about 60 or 65% original. The Lonesome Death of Geordie Verrill and The Crate are both adapted from short stories.
Extremely painful, Mr. Verrill.
No, this is going to be an entirely new experience.
What about the fact that you got so involved that you actually acted in that segment?
It was an interesting experience. I don't think I'd do it again. Acting is hard work. It's demanding. It's a lot of hurry up and wait. You spend, with this one, because there was a lot of makeup, I would sit in a chair and have this makeup put on for 4 hours or 5 hours, and then go on and you do it for 15 minutes, then you'd go and sit somewhere while they screwed around with the lights for half an hour, and then you do it again, and it's all in bits and pieces. And at the same time, when the time comes to do it, it has to be right, because there's a budget, and they don't want to carry over to the next day. Things pile up, complications begin. So there's a lot of pressure.
Do you think you'd like to produce your own film sometime?
No.
That's a good answer. You still have a continued association with the University of Maine in Orono. You attend various poetry readings, you participate in guest lectures. What kinds of memories come to your mind first when you enter the campus? And how has the University of Maine been a positive influence on your career?
Well, I think about my undergraduate time. I was an undergraduate there from 1966 to 1970, and those were very turbulent years. There was a lot of protests that went on. Winthrop Libby was president of the university. He was very understanding. He was probably the best man in that position at that time that could possibly have been. I think about the things that any graduate thinks about, the friends that I had and courses that I had, things that I didn't like about my coursework, things that made me impatient, things that seemed to not just broaden my horizons, but actually to exalt me. You know, there were times when you'd see something and you feel like the world was opening up in an intellectual sense, which is one of the things that college is supposed to be about.
Dave, when you think about the University of Maine in Orono and your days with Stephen King, what are some of the things that enter your mind first?
The first thing is when Steve came in to want to start writing for the Maine campus, which is the student newspaper. That's probably the first time that I got to know Steve well. Myself and a fellow by the name of Jeff Strout, who now works here also, were editing the Maine campus that year. And Steve came in one day and he said, "I'd like to write a column." And we said, "Okay, Steve." We knew who he was, and we talked with him a couple of times. And we said, "There's two rules, Steve. It's got to be here by noon Tuesday, and it's got to fit this space." And we showed him the space. And Steve so he said, "Fine," and off he went. And next Tuesday, it got to be about 11:30. No Steve King, no column, and we started to get a little edgy. And about 11:45, in comes Steve. Takes two pieces of clean white paper, and he sits down at a typewriter. And he puts one piece of the paper in, and he just starts to type. Do-do-do-do-do-do, just never stopped. And he finished that piece of paper, hauled out it, put the second piece in. And it was just like one of these printers we've got hooked up with these word processors. The words just flew out. And he read that over once and dropped it on my desk and said, "See you next week." And the column was perfect. We didn't put a pencil to it. And Steve would do that consistently, week after week. He'd come in with about 15 minutes to spare, pump one of those columns out, and it was always letter perfect. Steve is the kind of guy who went around all week building this column in his head and just rewriting it and writing it and putting it together in his thoughts, and then at the last minute would just like you pushed a button and out would come the copy.
Steve was even then probably the most prolific writer that I knew on the campus. He worked at it every day, and even then he knew, I'd have to say, he knew that he would make it. I remember Steve King once telling me as a student here at the University of Maine that when, not if, but when he became famous, the first thing he was going to do was buy I think it was a purple Cadillac. And when he became famous, he bought a Cadillac. I don't think it was purple, but he bought a Cadillac.
He came up after class one day and told me that he had written a novel and asked me if I would read it, and I said sure. And he brought it the next day, and I took it home. And I left it on the dining room table, and my wife picked it up and started reading it and didn't stop. And when she finished it, she gave it to me, and I started reading it, and I had the same experience. So I saw immediately that here was somebody with a really unusual sense of narrative, of just the ability to tell a story and keep it going and get a reader involved in it.
I think we all knew he was going to be a writer. Whether he was actually going to get into the kind of stuff that he's best known for now, I don't think that really developed that early.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about King's Garbage Truck?
That was the column that Steve wrote. It was called King's Garbage Truck. It's I can show you one here. I dug this out of the attic here today. I don't know if you can pick this up or not, but it was just a little spot like that, and we drew up this little logo, and that's what he called it. And he called it King's Garbage Truck because you never knew what you were going to find in the column. from one week to another. Interestingly, this is one from January 15, 1970, and it's his last will and testament. I point out to Steve that he bequeathed to the Folger Library a blank check. I suppose I'd like to come get that now. But and he also bequeathed to the Bangor Daily News his landlady. We did a main campus shot. It was in January of 1970. It was during the final exam period. And the picture was taken by a guy by the name of Frank Cady. And they were just fooling around one day. This is a stylized version of it, but we put out a little reminder to all the students that they'd ought to study because it was final exam period. It raised quite a furor on the campus. I think maybe more from the Dammit than from Steve King and the shotgun.
I remember all of those things, but ultimately I don't think the memories are as important to me as the reality of the university as a continuing influence on my life. Not only because that's what a good, broad college education is supposed to do, but because it's right there. I live in Bangor. It's 8 miles away. It's a resource.
What is it about Bangor, Maine that makes you feel comfortable about settling down here and making it a place to live and work?
I've been in love with Bangor for a long time because it seems like almost a mythical place to me. And in fact, I've written a very long novel called It. It's about 1,300 pages long about Bangor. The people here seem very honest and very, very, very real to me in the sense of they're just people that are there. They work hard. They work really hard. People from California don't know what work is. They come here and take a look at it. I've been treated here like I was a human being and not as a freak. They treat me the way that I feel that I am, as just a sort of an ordinary person who's doing a job and working hard at it.
Can you tell us something about your new book, Christine?
It's about a 1958 Plymouth, a haunted car, sold its soul for rock and roll. Really, that's what it's about. It's sort of like a malevolent Happy Days. And it's all sort of starts out in that sort of bubbly American graffiti way, and if it works the way it's supposed to work, it just sort of goes down about 3 blocks, and we're all having a great time, and it just takes this little skew and goes off into this nightmare.
What kinds of future plans do you have? How far ahead have you planned?
Lunch.